good. I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Tonight we are presenting Know Your Rights, Protesters' Rights. And our lovely community education manager, Jessica Howard, will be hosting tonight's webinar. And she has a bunch of special guests that she will be introducing throughout this webinar. As I said before, Jess is our community education manager. Prior to this role, she worked as the affiliate's paralegal for 6 years. And she, in her role as education manager, oversees the development and implementation of public education programs, including Know Your Rights trainings like this one. Jess is our returning champion for our webinars, so we're going to let her take it away.
Thank you so much, Delana. I can't get used to the whole returning champions. Feels like I'm on a game show, but it's kind of fun. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight for a presentation on Know Your Rights as it relates to protesters' rights. And so, of course, I think it's important that, we recognize and acknowledge, the reason why we are putting on this presentation is because of what we are seeing here in Denver and, across our state and across the nation as it relates to protests and demonstrations after the death of George Floyd by the hands of police. And on top of that, recurring and buildup of other police encounters and situations, and in response to that, going out and exercising our right to have our voices heard. And so certainly we thought that it was important that, we share with the community, in case, they may be out there, over the past couple of weeks or would like to go out and demonstrate what your rights are and how to protect yourself. And so that is what we will be discussing here tonight, along with, I'm so glad to have our Colorado affiliates legal director, Mark Silverstein, who has a lot of background and knowledge about protecting protesters' rights. And then also our voting and campaigns coordinator, Jen Samano, who is definitely going to talk to us about, when we are out and we may be recording, ways in which we can protect our digital privacy. So tonight, we're going to overview, it will be asserting our rights as a protester, as well as maybe go over some maybe commonly asked questions when people are out demonstrating and what they can do if their rights are violated. We'll also talk a little bit about the ACLU's fight to defend protesters' rights, as well as current litigation that is coming out of some of the demonstrations that we've been seeing in Denver, as well as talking about maybe some action steps, because we know the reason why we're seeing the increase in protests is related to the issue of police brutality. We can talk about, action steps to demand more accountability from our police officers and how you can get involved, and hopefully you will join us tonight to do a little bit of work in terms of reaching out to legislators for a bill that we are championing, and we'll talk a bit about later on. I do want to make a note, as Elena said, that my background is a paralegal, but I'm not an attorney. And even if I was an attorney, I would not be able to provide legal advice because every situation is different. Now, we are happy again to have Mark on the webinar tonight, and he certainly will be here to answer questions at the end that folks may have as it relates to protests, but know that even then, the webinar is intended to be a resource and that we won't be providing legal advice. So let's go ahead and dig right in. So protesters' rights. So we know that the right to protest is considered a fundamental right guaranteed under the U.S. Constitution in the First Amendment. The First Amendment gives you the right to march, make speeches, hand out leaflets, hold and attend rallies, carry posters, and demonstrate. And to know that the government cannot restrict your right to protest because of the content of your speech, even if it is considered controversial. So one of the first questions that we think about is, well, where can I and can't I protest? And a lot of this hinges on public forums. The First Amendment covers public spaces. So your rights are strongest here. So streets, sidewalks, parks, plazas, in front of the government buildings and other public property. This also can cover public schools, but may be restricted if it interferes with school activities, such as like when class is in session. It also covers public universities, but also know again that there may be restrictions for non-student and non-staff demonstrations there as well. And then of course, even though it may be in public spaces, there could be some restrictions when it comes to buildings if it may disrupt businesses going inside or out. So that's something to consider. So also know that the government can't stop you from peacefully protesting, and that you can record anything in plain view, including while the police are doing their jobs and in front of those buildings as well. And that also to make a note is that police must treat protesters and counter-protesters in the area equally. Now, of course, the right under the First Amendment doesn't cover private property, but if one were to decide that they wanted to hold a demonstration on private property, know that private owners are going to be able to set the rules for the speech on their property, and that may include whether or not folks can take photographs or do recordings of video. But know that because it is on private property, as long as you have the consent of the owner, there shouldn't be any government restrictions as it relates to your speech there. And then a final note is that the government can place some reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions in order, like if, for example, you could have like a town that might place an ordinance on like perhaps asking for a permit for sound amplifiers, certain things like that. But again, as long as that is not restricting the content of your speech, you have the right to demonstrate in public in that way. Okay. So certainly one of the questions that come up, and certainly one of the things that we have seen in the past couple of weeks is interactions with police while folks are demonstrating and protesting. And so certainly, one of the questions that come across is, well, what if I'm stopped by the police or detained by the police? Certainly there's some things to consider, staying calm, keeping your hands visible, and that, to not obstruct the police, even if you think like they may be violating your rights at the time. Just, continuously making it known, like your movements. Definitely, I think it's worth pointing out that you're not there to disrupt anyone's activity, and that the First Amendment protects your actions to peacefully protest. Note that if you are being stopped, know that you don't have to consent to a search of yourself or your belongings, because doing so and making that consent could affect your rights later on in court. And then, of course, if you are being detained, ask, am I being detained, or am I free to go, or am I free to leave? And if the officer says yes, then you can calmly walk away. Usually if they're saying yes, then what it means is that it's kind of a casual encounter, casual conversation. But definitely know if they say no, then you are being detained. And again, knowing again to stay calm, you don't have the right, you do have the right to stay silent, and you also don't have to consent to a search in that moment. However, things kind of change a bit if you are being arrested. If you are being arrested, then again, it's about trying to stay calm and to not resist the arrest. And this is more of an issue of keeping yourself safe in that moment. know that if you are being arrested, then police can at that time pat down your clothing if they suspect that you may have a weapon, or they may search you after an arrest. Also know that you do have the right to remain silent at that time, and to ask for an attorney, and to not say or sign anything without the attorney's presence. Certainly, we have been giving out information to folks that if they do find themselves in a situation where they are being arrested, then to certainly contact the Colorado Freedom Fund, which is co-directed by Elizabeth Epps and Evil Frickle, and they have been doing wonderful work before the protest and now in terms of bailing folks out who cannot afford to pay their bail, particularly around during this time when folks have been arrested by the police during these demonstrations. So a few frequently asked questions that we kind of get sometimes when it comes to protesters' rights that we just definitely want to point out, and that one of the questions is whether or not you need a permit to protest. And so we definitely want, folks to know that, certainly when you have breaking news, sort of like what is happening now with George Floyd's death, as well as, other deaths that we've seen around the country, that individuals don't need a permit to protest in that moment or to march on the sidewalk, as long as it's not obstructing traffic. Again, as we mentioned before, your rights are strongest in the public forums like streets, in front of government buildings, again, so long as you're not blocking access or interfering with operations. A note about permits, though, is that there are events that may require permits, such as like a march or parade that requires blocking traffic, or if you're having like, again, a rally and it requires like sound amplifiers, or even a rally over the size at certain parks and plazas. But outside of that, knowing that it doesn't necessarily mean you need a permit, and certainly government cannot restrict your ability to get a permit just because they don't like the content of your speech. Another question that has come up, particularly given some of the issues that we've kind of seen here in Denver, is whether or not police can tell protesters to disperse. And so certainly some things that, we see is that shutting down protests through an order like that law enforcement or police do really should, I think, be like the last resort. Police shouldn't break up a gathering unless there's some kind of immediate threat to public safety, not because, again, like they don't care for their speech or they don't care for them being there. And then certainly if police officers decide to issue a dispersal order, they should provide reasonable opportunity for folks to comply and sufficient time for them to exit the area. And so certainly not saying disperse and then immediately either breaking up the group through, physical force or tear gas, some of the things that we've seen. It's really important that we get across that officers should be providing that opportunity for people to actually disperse if they find that it's time to give out the order. And I'm hoping that perhaps when we talk a little bit about a case that has come up in the courts, that Mark might be able to talk a little bit more about dispersal orders. Another question certainly that comes up is whether or not you have the right to record police. And so certainly perhaps maybe as I've mentioned earlier, yes, you do have the right to record police. And certainly, over the past couple of weeks, it's been a really powerful reminder of how effective video can be in terms of holding law enforcement accountable. So know that, here's a few things, is that to make sure that you stand at a safe distance, and if possible, to use your phone to record video what is happening. As long as you're not interfering with what an officer is doing and you don't stand like close enough to obstruct their movements, you do have the right to observe and record events that are plainly visible in public spaces. And that if an officer tells you you can't record, then certainly making it very firm by saying, hey, officer, recording the police is protected under the First Amendment. The second thing is to try to not hide the fact that you're recording. Police officers do not have a reasonable expectation of privacy when they're performing their jobs, but people that they may be interacting with, may want to know that they are being recorded. And certainly, I think Jen will go into a little bit about like some of the issues and concerns when we are recording protests and we are recording others who may be coming into contact with police. And so Jen will talk about that a bit more. Third, that police officers may not confiscate or demand to view your video or photographs or video without a warrant, and they may not delete your photographs or video data under any circumstances. So if an officer orders you to stop recording or orders you to hand over your phone, again, you firmly, tell them that you're not consenting to doing so, and reminding the officer that you do have a First Amendment right to safely record them at a distance. Also know too, as sad as it is to be aware that officers may try to arrest or confiscate your phone anyway, if they feel like if you're refusing to comply with their order, even though it may be an illegal order. And so it's just kind of one of those things where we weigh like the personal risk of arrest, including like that risk that the officer may try your phone against the value of recording. And so that's kind of one of those situations of just kind of seeing the situation and doing what your gut tells you in that moment. So, and then also too, we always say like, if you are having issues in terms of coming up against police officers who are not letting you record, certainly the ACLU wants to know about those issues. And so I did put here the link to our legal request intake form, and we will be providing a copy of these slides that will have all of our materials for you to reference to later. So always know that too is an option. I also do want to note that if you may not want to use your own video recording feature, then certainly the ACLU of Colorado does have a mobile justice app, which you can find for free on the Apple App Store or Google Play. And certainly what this is that it allows someone to record, and then whether your phone is turned off, whether it's taken, dropped, then the recording stops and gets sent to the ACLU. Now, I will say, just as a note, only because I was in a position to help our organization try to go over and look at these videos, it's really important that after you record the video, to just go back and file a report. Sometimes, unfortunately, we would have situations where we would get a recording of a police encounter and say, oh, we definitely want to look into this, but we didn't have the name of the person who sent it or the name of the agency that the person was coming into contact with. So just kind of as a thumbs up is to try to go back and to give more detailed information if you can. And so with that, I think that the increased use of video recordings during police encounters and posting them we see many times on social media platforms certainly raises new questions that we have and concerns about privacy and the use of technology by police to surveil protesters. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jen Samano, who's our campaigns coordinator, to talk a bit about your digital privacy during a protest and ways in which you can protect yourself and others while you're going out and demonstrating.
Thanks, Jess. So I am here to help you remember your tinfoil hats. No, but in all seriousness, the aspects of privacy or the conversation can get lost in what we need to respond to in the immediate term, but I think it's helpful to remind ourselves of privacy concerns that take place during protests, especially because the issue of privacy rights, like the rest of our issues, very intersectional, and kind of underpins a lot of the other exercising of our rights. So before I go into some tips for you, I will very briefly speak to why this is a concern, why we are advocating for these tips. And that is just to say that the story of dissent and social movement in the US is also a story of government agencies surveilling, spying, and infiltrating those social movements, particularly social movements that are Black-led or to do with racial justice. They've been categorized as radical and as like enemies of the state, right? And so the issue there is that agencies like the FBI and the police should be policing violence and not policing dissent. But again, the history shows us something very different. I think what people know well is the COINTELPRO program from the civil rights era that lasted for over a decade. This was an FBI program that was extremely extensive and infiltrated every civil rights movement at the time. And in fact, through this program, there was targeting of Martin Luther King. An FBI agent, secret obviously, sent letters to Martin Luther King telling him he should give up and he should end his life and things like that. So very dark. But even though COINTELPRO is really well known, and the only reason we know about that is because of that group of students, I can't believe I'm forgetting their name, who broke into the FBI's offices and physically took those files to discover that, or else we may have never known. But even before that, there is a history, particularly in the early 1920s, of the government extensively using Black undercover officers and infiltrators into Black social movements at the time. More recently, fast forwarding to especially 2007, there was a leak, there was a redacted FBI documents released to do with FBI surveillance of activists surrounding the Ferguson Black Lives Matter protests. And so what we saw in there was that the FBI is made up a new term or classification called Black identity extremists. And that's a fictional categorization because unlike white supremacy, it's not really an ideology or a group. And so by using that terminology of Black identity extremists, the government then shoved under that umbrella, all sorts of Black activist movements. Again, the goals of those movements are for equality and striving for equal access to resources. They were not violent. And then we know this happens on the local level as well, with local police departments spying on and surveilling or monitoring activist groups. We saw it recently in Massachusetts a couple years ago also in Knoxville, Tennessee. And I'm happy to send any of those types of communications out, of those articles out, because again, it's too much in this one time. So that's kind of why we're making sure to have this conversation. And finally, also in Ferguson, the issue of, when the dust settled and the mass protests ended, a lot of threats of violence and a lot of violence enacted on major activist leaders in that group. So now that I've made everyone feel sad, we'll go into some tips about what you can do about it, what you can actually do when you're out in the field, as we said, when you're out protesting or demonstrating. So Jess mentioned this one, kind of talking about how if you're under arrest, then suddenly your phone can be searched. And so that's why it's important. Let's say you're heading out and that's a concern for you. then just disable your, like if you use the facial recognition thing to open your phone, or if you use a fingerprint or any other type of bio recognition feature, simply disable it, especially when you're going to a demonstration. So it's hard, if not impossible, for an officer to get into your phone. It can also be useful to turn off your GPS service, or I'm sorry, your location tracking services. So you're harder to track, especially if you are more on the organizing side of something, like you're organizing a protest and you're nervous that you could be tracked or something. Go ahead and turn off your location services. Another big one I think has gained popularity is using encrypted messaging services. So these are much harder for outside groups, whoever they may be, to hack into and to access. A very popular one is the Signal app, which provides also additional features like, let's say you're in a group chat, you can set a feature so it clears out all the messages every 24 hours. You can get very custom in there. This next one is review and adjust the privacy settings on your social media accounts, because there is a distinguishment, right, between whatever you, even though you're on a private website, you know, I actually don't use social media, but I know this from people who use social media and from my own trying to investigate people, right, is that if you post something publicly, then that is fair game for any other group, whether it's government or not, to monitor, to record, to add to their databases. However, if, let's say, someone was trying to, if a government agent, which they've been proven to do, makes a fake account and friend requests you, that would be surveillance, spying, and infiltration, right? So that's also why I think it could be useful. Let's say you're an organizer, make sure you actually know your friends, or take an extra second to try and vet someone. And this last one, I think is really pertinent, right? Is when you're out at a demonstration, always get consent before taking an identifiable picture of another person, right? So you might see there's this beautiful image and you're close to someone's face, the sun is shining on them and the Capitol's in the background and they're holding their sign above their head and it's beautiful, and you're just so inspired and feeling the energy of the protest and you want to take a picture of that person. Pause. I think that's the whole theme of privacy rights and exercising. Pause and think about it, or put a measure in place. Right here, the measure would be simply asking that person for the consent to take their photo. Again, it seems simple, but it makes a huge difference. Just because someone is publicly demonstrating doesn't mean they want to be on the internet's public forum. And so another way you can do that, in what some of our supporters were doing when they were out this weekend, is taking shots from behind, so you can only see the back of people's heads, and they're still powerful pictures. Or take a selfie of yourself. I guess that's redundant. But yeah, those are some quick tips. If folks would like more information or follow up on some of the history I kind of butchered and tried to throw in there, I'm very happy to share resources and continue that conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Jen. I love my privacy and surveillance queen.
It's a two-person team.
Yes. So certainly, I think like what Jen has like expressed and shown folks is that, you know, our organization like definitely keeps abreast of how law enforcement uses technology and force tactics to, you know, kind of like subdue protesters' First Amendment rights. And, you know, the ACLU has worked over the years through litigation and public records requests to continue to keep folks accountable. Certainly, you know, we've seen on the news things that have been going on, particularly in Denver, about the way in which police have been interacting with protesters. And from that, litigation has arisen. This litigation that has come about is not being pushed by the ACLU, but we are definitely keeping abreast about, you know, what is happening. And so I'm hoping that perhaps our legal director, Mark Silverstein, could tell us about the current litigation that is going through the courts right now as it relates to defending protesters' rights in the order that recently came out by Judge Jackson to protect those rights. So Mark, I'll hand it off to you.
Sure. I think on the very first night that the protests began, a week ago Thursday, when I heard that police were shooting pepper ball guns into crowds and shooting pepper ball guns directly at protesters, I thought, wait a minute. We had written a detailed letter to Denver police back during the Occupy Denver demonstrations, explaining that that never should pepper ball guns be used as a form of crowd control. They should not be shot at peaceful demonstrators, and certainly they should never be shot at people's heads. And now we're seeing people who have been hit in the eye with these pepper ball guns. And people, there's a story in the paper this morning of someone who has lost an eye. In our letter to Denver a few years ago, we explained a woman actually died from being shot in the eye with a pepper ball gun. And it turns out protesters are being attacked also by other kinds of projectiles. There's talk of rubber bullets. These actually might be foam projectiles that are intended to be shot at the body to basically stop a person. They're used properly, maybe to stop a potentially suicidal person, so that police can stop them from cutting themselves and can stop the person and then like approach the person without fear of the weapon being used against the police. But they're not supposed to be used for crowd control in these situations. And of course, we're seeing also some kinds of chemical irritants. There's pepper irritants or pepper spray type compounds in these pepper ball guns, but also tear gas or CS gas is being discharged on crowds of peaceful protesters. Judge Jackson had an emergency hearing on Friday evening, and he issued a pretty amazing order in an effort to stop the attacks on protesters. And I should mention it's not just protesters that are attacked, but also reporters and also people who are serving as medics to help people who are wounded or injured by police attacks. But the court ordered that that the Denver police officers are forbidden to employ chemical weapons or projectiles of any kind against persons engaging in peaceful protests or demonstrations. And then he said to ensure that this, what he called idealistic order, is carried out, he made a number of more specific prohibitions. Besides, in the event that some of these projectile weapons are used, presumably, I guess, if the demonstrators are no longer peaceful, the judge said you still cannot use them to target the head, the pelvis, or the back. The judge prohibited firing any of these projectiles into crowds. At the hearing, the Denver lawyer was saying, well, you know, it wasn't just Denver police that were there. There were officers from a number of additional jurisdictions that Denver had invited in to help the Denver police. And Denver's lawyer said, so, you know, if someone has a problem, they need to figure out which police department it was. If it was a Denver police officer, they might have a complaint with Denver. But if it's an Aurora police officer, the protester shouldn't be complaining in a lawsuit that's against Denver. And the judge gave short shrift to that. He said, all the invited law enforcement officers from other jurisdictions are invited by Denver. Denver's responsible. Denver has to make sure that all the invited jurisdictions comply with this order. Tear gas should only be used if the police have reason to disperse a crowd that is becoming a threat to public safety. And even in that kind of situation, police cannot discharge tear gas unless they first issue a clear, audible order to disperse. Maybe issue the order several times. And before they need to say, if this crowd does not disperse in X number of minutes, there will be tear gas. But they also need to make sure that the crowd is notified of a route to escape. Where can the crowd go? How can the crowd comply with the police order? All these are necessary prerequisites to using that extreme and what should be a rarely used tactic of dispersing a crowd. So those are some of the orders that Judge Jackson issued. And some of those are really ordering Denver police to comply with the department's own use of force policy. What's been going on in the Denver streets, especially on the first 4 or 5 days of the demonstrations, officers were not complying with Denver's own policy. It was, and it appears that supervisory officers surely must have been looking the other way because these violations of Denver policy and also violations of constitutional rights were so frequent and so widespread that the higher ups had to know about them. And by letting them go on, they were essentially approving of them. And that's why Denver can certainly expect not one, but probably many, many lawsuits over what's happened in the last week.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mark, for going over the lawsuit, because I think it really is important, you know, certainly as folks continue to go out and demonstrate, knowing that, you know, Judge Jackson's order is hopefully helping to protect them from this kind of use of force.
I guess I should say that it does appear in the last 5-6 days, I'm not sure the count, that the Denver police have been using much more restraint, and these attacks that we saw in the first 4 or 5 days don't seem to be carried on, or if they are, it hasn't been the main thing that's been going on, and so that is definitely.
Yeah.
So I think it is safe to go out and demonstrate. So I don't want to discourage people by talking about all these chemical weapons and dangerous projectiles. So I think the police have calmed down for now.
For now, right? So, and it is definitely kind of like one of those things that is important that, you know, we keep in the background of, like, you know, certainly we have orders like this to help protect folks, but, you know, certainly I do, you know, want to go over, like, if, you know, you're finding yourself in a position where you are seeing like police misconduct or use of force, you know, here are just a few tips to kind of think about in terms of that is, you know, write down everything you remember if you can, officer's badge, you know, patrol car, agency they work for. Certainly I know, you know, being out there in the demonstrations, that's certainly a lot harder to do when you're running away from being tear gas. But certainly this is just kind of good practice, whether you're demonstrating or if you're being, you know, stopped, you know, by an officer in traffic. These are just kind of good tips to think of. Certainly, if you can, get contact information from witnesses that might be around. And then if you are injured, certainly seek medical attention immediately and take photographs of the injuries. You know, part of like what helps with this litigation is when people take pictures of, like, you know, how bad some of these injuries from being either pepper sprayed or having these foam projectiles coming at their face, and the impact and the repercussions from that. It's just really important to document that. And then also, you know, there is, you know, certain agencies will have a process in which you can file a written complaint with the Internal Affairs Division or complaint. So certainly one of the best places to start is online. A lot of agencies, including Denver and Aurora, do have ways to file those complaints online. And then again, I always, like to mention that if you believe that your rights have been violated, then you can always contact the ACLU of Colorado through our online legal request form. Certainly never a guarantee that we'll take the case, but at least it will keep us apprised of what's happening out there in our community. So with that, I would like to transition and state we know and understand the reason behind the current protests and demonstrations that we're witnessing is rooted in what we've witnessed and encountered as it relates to police brutality, and particularly against communities of color, particularly against Black communities. And that in response to these protests, police are using, more force and brutality against the community. And so this definitely brings us to a pivotal juncture in our work in terms of increasing demands for police accountability. So with that, I do want to turn our attention to SB 2217, which is the Law Enforcement Integrity and Accountability Act. So, and certainly, Mark, you could definitely chime in if I get this, if I'm oversimplifying anything here. But essentially what this bill would do is it would allow Coloradoans to seek a redress against peace officers for constitutional violations in state court versus filing them in federal court. And so for a bit of context, in general situations, when the ACLU has brought litigation against a police department and or their officers specifically, we typically file those cases in federal court because of the protections that citizens have under the Constitution in federal statute that imposes that civil liability on police officers who deprive individuals of their rights, and kind of just paves the way for a person to seek damages and attorney's fees. And this is mostly covered under Section 1983 of the US Code. However, many times in defense of these violations, police officers rely on what's called a qualified immunity defense to justify their actions. And in a nutshell, qualified immunity is essentially this legal doctrine that protects government agents like police officers who violate someone's constitutional rights from being liable for their actions in a law. And so what this bill would do is to help folks find that redress in state court because qualified immunity so often is used by police officers to perpetually discriminate and use violence against communities of color without a fear of being held accountable. So
let me jump in just as,
yes.
So I just want to say what this does is many of the things that police officers do that violate our federal constitutional rights, they also violate the state constitution, but there is no way to file a lawsuit for violation of your state constitutional rights. So this bill would establish a law that says you can go to court to sue for when your rights under the state constitution are violated, and then says there won't be any of this qualified immunity nonsense in a suit under the state constitution. So it is a progressive measure that we have advocated for all the time I've worked for the ACLU, and it's exciting to see it being close to a reality.
Yes, for sure. And it kind of goes into like that first point there that we see there in terms of definitely holding officers more accountable now in state court under the state constitution, and kind of removing that defense that they usually hide under in order to skirt responsibility.
And the other piece of it is that if people can seek redress in state courts, then they will be going before judges that are not appointed by the current administration in Washington.
That is a good point. Very good point. Let's see, other things that it does is that it mandates body cameras. So all officers should have body-worn cameras and record their interactions with members of the public, and may penalize officers who don't activate their body cams or they fail to turn it on. Now, of course, it's not going to, I believe, penalize them if there's like something like wrong with their technology and they were unaware of it. But certainly it does require more from police officers to turn that on. There will be public reporting on policing data, so law enforcement agencies need to start tracking and reporting the data, including demographic information, uses of force, and searches of civilians when there are forced entries into the home. There is also, in terms of trying to do more to rein in the use of deadly force by officers, as well as preventing the rehiring of kind of bad officers. So officers who are found to be untruthful or terminated for cause should be, I believe, there's still in the law to a database to kind of start tracking some of these officers that have that track record. Some additional amendments that have been added in the course of time, and I'll talk a little bit about the bill's history, is that it's now creating a duty for police officers to intervene to stop their fellow officers from the use of excessive force, and the failure to do so will then trigger in discipline. And so in cases of serious bodily injury or death, officers need to do more to intervene in those situations. It explicitly is outlawing chokeholds, certainly the kind of chokeholds that we've unfortunately seen in cases of George Floyd and Eric Garner in New York. And also protects protesters from violence. And this is certainly probably a lot to do with the things that we have seen in the past couple of weeks in Denver, and in response to the litigation and Judge Jackson's orders to limit when and how police are using those projectiles and chemical agents against the crowd. And so that has found its way into the bill. So the bill was introduced last Wednesday in the Senate's State Affairs Committee, and it has now passed, even with a unanimous vote on the third reading out of Senate. So we definitely want to thank our policy team and our policy department for their tireless work in terms of making this a reality. So now this bill goes to the House, and this is where we can certainly use your support to encourage a few representatives to champion this bill so that it passes intact and with all its key provisions. Because at the end of the day, our communities should not be living in fear of officials who are supposed to serve and protect the public. And so we definitely want to make sure that this bill continues on as strong as possible. So there's a few things that we're kind of asking folks to do as we're getting prepared to see this bill move on to the House, is to reach out to representatives that could use a bit of support or an extra push to support the bill. And so, again, I have a few things here. I will be sending out the slides tomorrow just to make sure that they are final, and if there's any edits that I need to make. And so certainly this is something that you can do now, but this will also be helpful if you want to, find time to do it. So I have a few representatives here with their contact and information, email, Facebook, Twitter. And so if you are someone who really enjoys using social media platforms, certainly we encourage you to, reach out either to these representatives or your own representative that represents you. And we have just kind of a sample here in terms of, you want police accountability. So I'll take myself, for example. I want police accountability because I don't want to fear that my Black son, with autism may be at risk for harm by the police. And then using a representative Twitter handle, we need you to defend, SB 217 and end qualified immunity, which has shielded officers from accountability and denied families justice, protect people of color from police violence. So finding a reason, what speaks to you as to why you want police accountability. And so certainly this is just one sample here. If you are a person who just prefers to email people, we also have a sample message here. You can write to your own representative or one of the representatives that we have on the screen, asking them to support. And again, expressing that community shouldn't live in fear from police officers when their job and duty is to protect us, and to ensure that more importantly, like the qualified immunity piece stays intact in the bill, and to express why, again, you personally support police accountability. So certainly I can leave these up on the screen for like about a minute, but know that I will be sending this out to everyone who has attended and who has signed up for the webinar for you to keep on hand as we continue on to get this bill passed.
Jess, did you want to take a question while people are writing this stuff down?
Absolutely, and let me know if I need to, if any folks want to tweet instead, then I can also go back to the other screen, but we certainly can. I do have probably just a summary, and then we can definitely dive into questions.
Okay, well, we can wait, definitely, and let people have a chance to tweet. It's important to let the representatives know that we support this bill.
And again, if folks just want to send off a quick tweet or need a sample tweet, we have the message. And this, I think, is also good for Facebook as well, if you prefer Facebook instead. For Representative Snyder, it appears for social media, Facebook is what we have. Okay. Alrighty. So just again, for quick summary, if there's, nothing else that you leave out of tonight, certainly it's just these key points, as you're out protesting, demonstrating, or in the future is, certainly if you come across, a police encounter during this time, remembering to stay calm, asserting that the right to protest is protected under the First Amendment, and that if you are stopped by an officer, you can always ask if you're free to go. If you are free to go and they say yes, then to slowly just walk away. If you are also being detained and the officer asks to look into your belongings, know that you have the right to refuse consent to the search. And that if you are arrested, know that you have the right to remain silent and ask for an attorney. I do want folks to know that if they ever do find themselves in a situation where, they've been arrested, booked, they're in jail, and they have a chance to make a phone call, know that your calls with the attorneys are protected, and that jail should not be listening to your conversations with attorneys, but they may be able to listen if you are talking with a family member or friend. So just understand and be aware of that distinction. And then finally know that if you're recording, that officers may not confiscate or demand to view your photographs without a warrant, and they certainly shouldn't be looking to destroy your data either. Okay, and so with that, definitely want to open it up for questions.
All right. So now we're ready for questions. Sorry, I jumped the gun there. And if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A box, and we will start with the easy one I can answer. Are the representatives on the screen the correct recipients of our emails and tweets, or would it be best to send the message to my area's representative? And I would say both, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or, okay. So go ahead and send it to your representative, and also tweet at the folks that we were talking about tonight. These people need a little extra support is what we understand. Okay. And Catherine asked, what are the laws regarding curfew?
That was a good question. Mark, would you be able to guide us on that?
So I would assume that the question is about the kinds of curfews that were declared in response to the mass protests. There are cases that have upheld these kinds of emergency curfews when there is so much what I think the authorities would call rioting, mayhem, disorder, that the police need drastic measures to bring things under control and calm it down. The curfews are an extremely drastic measure because they basically forbid people to be outside exercising their First Amendment rights. I know that in my first year as an ACLU attorney in Los Angeles, I was there for the uprising that followed the acquittal of the officers that beat Rodney King. And there was widespread buildings burning, there was lots of property destruction, people going into stores and helping themselves to merchandise. And it was quite a scene. And I was supposed to research whether we could do a challenge to that curfew. And I think the decision was that the disorder, if you'd call it that, was so extreme and the measure was viewed as being short-lived that the decision was made not to try to challenge it. But I know that I was at the ACLU of Southern California then. Now, in the last week, the ACLU of Southern California has filed a challenge to the Los Angeles curfew on the grounds that it is unjustifiably broad and is suppressing the First Amendment rights of Black Lives Matter. So, but what happens if the courts are going to view the emergency as urgent and the problem that the curfew is meant to resolve as drastic and extreme enough, the courts are likely to uphold the authorities' attempt to let's suppress people's liberty for a few days and then see if we can get things to calm down. So it's hard to challenge them in that kind of a situation. Did we have that kind of situation in Denver? I don't think so.
Thank you.
The next question is, please speak to the issue of police not being required to be truthful to you, but that you may be in violation if you lie to the police, violation of the law. So I think they're trying to say that it's okay for the police to lie, but we're not allowed to lie.
Well, watching TV, you know that or reading the news, it's a crime to lie to the FBI. It's not actually a crime to lie to local police in each and every situation the way it is with the FBI. But the question certainly identifies a power imbalance. But I guess the idea is that when police are investigating a crime and they are legitimately trying to get some answers, if providing false information interferes with their ability to discharge their legitimate jobs, that's I think why that false information can be penalized.
Great, thank you. How do we know when a police order to disperse is really justified or just something they are doing but not justified?
That is a really good question. And I think the answer is you don't. And you certainly don't have the right to keep on demonstrating in the face of the police issuing an erroneous or unjustified dispersal order. It's advised to comply with the dispersal order and then seek some other form of redress to challenge the police erroneously or unjustifiably dispersing a protest.
Great. And can they use curfew as a reason to order dispersal?
That's a good question too. I would think not. But I actually would have to go hit the books on that one.
Okay. And probably both of you can answer this. What recourse do we have against law enforcement who fail or refuse to identify themselves?
Well, I'd like to get a photo of them.
I bet you would.
I guess you can't just file a complaint of unidentified officer failed to identify himself and ask for supervisory discipline unless the supervisors can identify the officer. You know, about the curfew, I think that we have to taking the position that dispersing a demonstration has got to be a last resort when the demonstration is a threat to public order. And I don't think merely being outside after an artificial time constraint of a curfew is that kind of threat to public order that merits dispersal. So I guess I would think that the police response should be issue tickets to people.
Okay, great. Last question, unless somebody else wants to type in a question into the question box. This person says, I've read a lot about war crimes in the Geneva Convention. Have these been violated by police?
I have heard some assertions that the kind of discharge of chemical devices for crowd control is actually a violation of the laws of war. I don't know that, but I think that there are some people who feel that it might violate some of the chemical weapons treaties.
All right, great. And that's all the questions we have right now. I did want to put in a plug for our Lunch and Learn on Thursday, which is at noon, and that is about immigrant detention, another bill that is making its way through the Colorado legislature right now. So you can go on peoplepower.org and sign up for that Lunch and Learn webinar. Do we have any final words or concluding thoughts?
I think maybe one more question popped up.
Oh, you're right, Jess, you are right. And what is the timeline for the House vote on the Senate bill?
That is a good question. So I know that they had their third reading in the Senate today. And so I think we just need to go and look and see like when it will be introduced in the House Veteran Affairs Committee. And so I don't have that information right offhand, but I do usually know that the Colorado General Assembly's website is like a really good way to track those bills. And so certainly when I send out the message tomorrow, what I will add is I'll add a link to their website so then folks can track the bill as it goes through. And you know, we're definitely very we feel good about like its it's being able to go through the House. And so certainly we'll continue to ask folks to continue to press their legislators to support it, and then hopefully also be pressing the governor to sign and pass it. So I'll make sure I add that link so folks can track it.
Great, that's wonderful. Trying to see if we have any other questions. No, we don't. But again, join us on Thursday at noon for immigrant detention webinar. And this has been absolutely great. It's always great to have Mark.
Yeah, I just want to thank Mark so much for coming on and answering questions and talking to us about the legislation, the litigation that's happening right now, and to thank Jen so much for giving us the history about, you know, police and surveilling protesters, and why it's, you know, so important to, when we do protest, to go out being savvy and educated about that as well. And thank you so much, Delana, for our ultimate like champion on webinars, because she's been on every single
And
one.
thank you, Jess, for a great presentation.
Yes. Yes.
Awesome.
All right.
Thank
you for everybody for attending tonight. Oh, we got a question.
Yeah.
Let's see. And they said this was so informative. The digital piece was rad. So thank you to anonymous attendee for that wonderful compliment.
I appreciate your anonymity for all.
Yes. All right. Well, we will see you all on Thursday, and everybody, we got one more. Okay, thanks, Ron. And we will see you all on Thursday, right? You're all going to join us on Thursday and learn about the immigrant detention bill. So thanks so much, everyone. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jess.